They teach us that Rome fell, that it decayed from within, collapsing under the weight of corruption, decadence, and barbarian invasions. They tell us it was inevitable, that great empires simply don't last. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the fall of Rome wasn't just a tragedy, but a cover-up? There are ruins scattered across Europe like broken bones buried in the soil, roads that go nowhere, aqueducts that still stand after 2,000 years. In fields where farmers now plant wheat, marble statues once gazed down on the empire of the world, and yet something about the story doesn't quite fit. The dates blur, the reasons change, the records are incomplete, suspiciously so. Imagine a world where the most advanced civilization of its time disappears almost overnight. Its language replaced, its gods silenced, its libraries torched, its identity rewritten by men who came after. How do you lose a world like Rome unless someone wanted it gone? There's something almost surgical about the disappearance. One day, Rome is the center of everything: law, culture, engineering, medicine, architecture. The next, it's as if a veil drops over history. The lights go out, the clocks stop ticking, and the voice of an empire is drowned in whispers. Of course, the textbooks point to the Goths, the Vandals, the endless civil wars. But scratch beneath the surface and the timeline starts to fracture. How could an empire with such advanced infrastructure and governance vanish so completely that even its name begins to fade? There are letters from monks centuries later, marvelling at ruins they didn't know how to replicate. Roman concrete still stands, while medieval castles crumble. How did people go from building the Pantheon to not even knowing how to make glass windows? And then there are the oddities. Bridges built in the style of Rome, but dated long after its supposed collapse. Coins from emperors who aren't mentioned in any history books. Frescoes painted with techniques forgotten for 500 years. It's as if the fingerprints of Rome refused to fade, but someone kept trying to wipe them away. Somewhere in the shadows of time, something happened. Not just a fall, but a purge. A systematic dismantling of knowledge, memory, and legacy. Rome wasn't merely defeated, it was deliberately dismantled. Erased, brick by brick, from the narrative of history. This wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of silence. But why? Who stood to gain from the vanishing of Rome? Why tear down what could have endured for centuries more? Who turned the lights off? And what were they trying to hide? The story most of us grew up with was crafted much later by the victors of a very different age. Medieval scribes working under the authority of new kings and new gods. These scribes weren't just copying history, they were rewriting it. It wasn't enough for Rome to fall. Its memory had to be rewritten in such a way that it seemed inevitable, that it appeared rotten from the inside, that it served as a warning, not an inspiration. They needed the Roman past to look like a failure, so that their new world would seem like progress. And it worked. For generations, we've looked back on the Roman Empire as something ancient and distant, a cautionary tale rather than a cultural inheritance. But step closer, look carefully. The ghosts of Rome are everywhere, in legal systems, in city grids, in plumbing and waterworks, in the very languages spoken across Europe. The DNA of Rome is embedded in the West, and yet its story was buried beneath centuries of dust, flame, and manipulation. Perhaps Rome was too advanced for its time. Perhaps its existence contradicted the power structures that followed. Maybe those who rose in the ashes needed Rome to look like a broken myth, not a lost reality. Because if people believed that Rome had mastered sanitation, medicine, architecture, and literacy long before medieval kings even knew how to sign their names, what would that say about the so-called progress of the Dark Ages? Maybe that's why the empire had to be forgotten, because remembering it would raise too many uncomfortable questions. like how humanity could go backward for nearly 1,000 years, like why technologies and knowledge took centuries to re-emerge, like why there was a time when the average peasant lived better under Roman rule than under medieval lords. The truth isn't just buried in ruins, it's buried in silence, in gaps, in the missing pages of manuscripts, in the charred remains of scrolls, in the deliberate mistranslations and altered dates. This story isn't about nostalgia, it's about truth. It's about the uncomfortable realization that history isn't just something that happened, it's something that was shaped, edited, and sometimes erased. What happened to Rome wasn't just a collapse, it was a theft of memory, of legacy, of continuity, a heist so vast it rewrote the trajectory of an entire continent. And we're only just beginning to uncover the clues. Somewhere, deep in the Italian countryside, there's a road that runs perfectly straight for miles. Farmers pass over it every day without a second thought. But if you dig beneath the soil, just a few inches down, you'll find smooth, ancient stones laid out with such precision they haven't shifted in over 1,000 years. That road wasn't built by medieval peasants, it was Roman. It's one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of pieces still left behind by a civilization that was supposedly lost. Aqueducts still carry water, sewers still run under cities, arches that held up amphitheatres still stand, despite centuries of war, weather, and neglect. You'd expect these to be studied, celebrated, replicated, but for most of history, they weren't. It's as if no one wanted to remember how advanced Rome really was. The fall of Rome, they say, came in waves. First the economy weakened, then the borders cracked. Barbarians swept in, emperors were assassinated, legions turned against each other. But while battles may explain a government's collapse, they don't explain a civilizational blackout. What happened in the centuries that followed was more than chaos, it was amnesia. The Roman world didn't just vanish, it was overwritten. Cities were abandoned, temples repurposed or destroyed, statues defaced, Latin twisted into something barely recognizable, and most hauntingly of all, the libraries, some of them vast repositories of science, philosophy, medicine, and history, burned or disappeared without a trace. You'd think those in power would have rushed to preserve Roman knowledge, but they didn't. In fact, they often did the opposite. Monks were ordered to copy religious texts, not scientific ones. Imperial histories were rewritten through the lens of a new morality. Maps shrank, calendars changed, medicine regressed, mathematics lost entire systems, and the deeper you look, the more... It seems like this wasn't just neglect, it was strategy. It's hard to rule people who know what they've lost. Easier to convince them that darkness is all they've ever known. In some old manuscripts there are strange notes in the margins. A half-erased figure here, a crossed-out date there. Historians puzzled over these for centuries. Some called them mistakes. Others now believe they were edits, deliberate changes to rewrite timelines. A few extra years here, a shifted reign there, enough to bend reality just enough to fit the new order. It was subtle at first, but it grew. Over time, entire figures were removed, emperors erased from memory, cities misattributed. Even architectural marvels like domes and basilicas were claimed by later eras, as if Rome had never built them at all. And who was doing the rewriting? Much of the early medieval world was run by those who saw Rome not as a predecessor, but a threat. The early church was one of the only institutions with the resources to preserve or destroy information. Kings, bishops, and scribes worked together, sometimes intentionally, sometimes just through the slow, grinding force of power, to reshape the story of the past. Because the idea of Rome was dangerous, it suggested that the world had once been more rational, more connected, more humane, that people had lived in cities with sewage systems, public baths, libraries, and hospitals, that an ordinary citizen once had more legal rights than a medieval peasant, that comparison couldn't be allowed. So the memory had to be dulled, blunted, turned into myth. Rome became a story of pride and downfall, not of brilliance and achievement. The empire that had once united the Mediterranean under laws and roads and trade was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in dusty halls. But traces remained. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, continued for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West. There, in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, the Roman flame still flickered, and yet even this survival was later diminished in Western narratives. Byzantium was called decadent, weak, alien, its language Greek, its people not truly Roman. This wasn't just historical confusion, it was narrative control, because if the Eastern Empire was truly Roman, then Rome hadn't really fallen, and that meant the whole story of decline and darkness would need to be questioned. The truth is far more complex than we're led to believe. Rome didn't just die, it fragmented, it morphed. Some of it survived in the East, some of it was buried in the West, and some of it, the most inconvenient parts, were quietly erased. And yet, even in the Middle Ages, there were whispers. A bishop in Gaul who kept Roman law alive, a scholar in Moorish Spain who rediscovered lost texts, a stonemason who built a bridge using forgotten techniques. The knowledge never fully vanished, it simply hid. But every now and then someone stumbled upon a forgotten piece. A statue pulled from a river, a vault cracked open in an abandoned monastery, a document uncovered behind a false wall, and each time the same reaction: shock, disbelief, awe, as if no one expected the ancients to be so advanced. What if that awe is the key? What if the reason we're taught to think of Rome as distant, broken and irrelevant is because its truth would make us ask too many questions about what came after? Not all collapses are natural, some are crafted, and this one, perhaps, was one of the most carefully constructed illusions in human history. In a quiet corner of southern France, a farmer once unearthed a mosaic while tilling his field. It was breathtaking. Colourful tiles still arranged in perfect geometric harmony, the image of a Roman god staring up from beneath centuries of soil. The farmer had no idea what he was standing on. Beneath his feet lay the remnants of an entire Roman villa, buried and forgotten, as if the earth itself had tried to hide it. But this wasn't an isolated find. These buried wonders appear everywhere across Europe. Elegant villas in England, marble statues in Germany, theatres in Spain, temples in Croatia, pieces of a world that supposedly collapsed, yet stubbornly refuses to vanish. The strange thing isn't that Rome left so much behind. It's that the people who came after seemed determined not to acknowledge it. Take the city of Trier in modern-day Germany. It still holds Roman baths, an amphitheatre, and a massive city gate that towers over medieval buildings like a ghost of an older world. But for centuries, few locals even knew what these structures truly were. They passed them every day, but the story behind them had been washed away, rewritten, or ignored. The same is true for the Roman Forum, which by the Middle Ages had become a cow pasture. The very heart of ancient Rome was buried beneath mud and silence. No tourists, no signs, just livestock grazing where senators once debated the fate of the empire. How does a civilization so vast, so proud, so accomplished, become invisible? Part of the answer lies not in what was lost, but in who was telling the story. After the empire fragmented, Europe fractured into smaller kingdoms, each with its own rulers, its own church officials, its own agenda. These new powers didn't inherit Rome's glory. They built their legitimacy in contrast to it. Rome was portrayed as pagan, decadent, and godless, a cautionary tale, not a source of inspiration. Its gods had been replaced, its values rewritten, And the people, they were made to forget, slowly, strategically, through rituals, sermons, and stories that glorified the new age and cast the old one into shadow. Even language was reshaped. Latin, once the language of law and logic, was now confined to monasteries and churches. The everyday people were nudged into new dialects, new names, new myths. The very words of Rome became foreign. But despite the silence, not everyone forgot. In remote corners of the empire, monks continued copying ancient texts, some without even understanding what they meant. In Moorish Spain, scholars translated Roman treatises into Arabic, preserving knowledge that had been banned elsewhere. And in Constantinople, Roman law was still practiced, Roman military tactics still taught, Roman titles still used. The torch had not gone out, it had simply been carried elsewhere. And then, in the West, came something strange. In the 12th century, builders began constructing cathedrals using techniques no one remembered teaching: massive arches, perfect domes, mathematical precision. Where did this knowledge come from? Some claimed it was divine. Others whispered of forgotten books, hidden vaults, ancient blueprints unearthed beneath crumbling cities. The truth, much of it was Roman. Stone by stone, the old knowledge returned, not all at once, not openly, but like a fog lifting after a long night. Still, the narrative had already been shaped. Rome was dead, they said. It had fallen into ruin. It had been punished for its pride. And the new world, the world of kings and clergy, was a different, better world. But cracks appeared in the story. Why did the old roads last longer than new ones? Why did Roman aqueducts still flow while medieval towns drank from wells? Why did 1,000-year-old domes stand firm while new churches collapsed? And more than that, why did no one seem eager to answer those questions? The more you study the so-called fall of Rome, the more it begins to resemble a controlled demolition. Not a spontaneous collapse, but a methodical erasure. The kind you don't notice at first, until you look around one day and realize the world you once knew is gone. Historians often speak of the Dark Ages as if they were just a pause in progress. But darkness isn't just the absence of light, it can be the deliberate act of turning the lights off. And when they did, they hid not just buildings and roads, but ideas. Ideas about governance, citizenship, medicine, and public good. Ideas that threatened the emerging systems of monarchy and religious authority. Ideas that suggested the people could be more than subjects. They could be citizens. That kind of memory is dangerous. So it was buried, not just under mud and rubble, but under centuries of silence, shame, and distortion. But here's the strange part. Rome never fully left. Its bones are in our cities. Its ideas echo in our laws. Its spirit lingers in the very concept of civilization. Every time we build a road that stretches straight into the horizon, every time we write a contract, every time we gather in a public square, we are repeating something Roman. And perhaps that's what they couldn't erase. They could burn the books, tear down the statues, silence the poets, but they couldn't fully destroy the blueprint, because Rome wasn't just an empire, it was a framework, a way of thinking, a way of living. And blueprints, once drawn, are hard to forget. In the highlands of Scotland, among mist-covered hills and crumbling stone walls, there lies a strange fort. Not Celtic, not Viking, but unmistakably Roman, built by hands that crossed mountains and rivers to bring the empire's order to the edge of the known world. This wasn't just conquest, it was an attempt to mould the very landscape into something Roman. But centuries later, few remembered who built it or why. The stones remained, but the story was missing. And that's how erasure works. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't destroy everything, it leaves just enough behind to confuse, to cast doubt, to rewrite without suspicion. Rome's reach had once been unimaginable. From the sands of North Africa to the forests of Germany, from the Atlantic Ocean to the banks of the Euphrates, it stitched together cultures, trade, law, and knowledge. It wasn't perfect, but it was unified. And then, almost as quickly as it rose, it was gone, or so we're told. But buried in forgotten corners of Europe are clues that tell another story. They whisper of a transition, not a fall, of power shifting from marble halls to stone abbeys, of knowledge moving from open forums to locked scriptoriums, of an empire not destroyed but slowly dismembered and then hidden. The West didn't wake up one day to find Rome gone. It was a slow erosion, libraries closing one by one, roads left unrepaired, laws once enforced across continents now ignored by petty lords. People began to look inward, afraid of a world no longer connected, and while they were distracted by the loss, someone was rewriting the beginning. That rewriting wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Rome, once the beacon of polytheism and civic pride, was recast as wicked, immoral, corrupt. A place that had to fall so a better world could rise. That narrative justified everything. The burning of texts, the suppression of science, the abandonment of art. It made forgetting Rome not just acceptable, but necessary. But it wasn't forgotten everywhere. In Baghdad, scholars pored over Roman medical texts, translating them into Arabic and building hospitals based on Roman models. In Constantinople, senators still debated laws in Roman chambers, wearing Roman robes, passing Roman edicts. Even in Viking territories, traders carried Roman coins centuries after the empire had supposedly vanished, proof of Rome's value lingering in distant hands. And yet in the heart of Europe, the continent that had once been Rome's pride, knowledge dimmed. Why? Because power prefers a blank slate. The rise of feudal lords and monarchs wasn't compatible with a world that remembered sanitation systems, citizen rights, and elected councils. Those memories had to be buried. They didn't just suppress the achievements of Rome, they made sure people believed they'd never existed. And as each generation passed, the story grew thinner. Rome became a fairy tale, a world of togas and orgies and emperors gone mad. The achievements? Forgotten. The innovations? Undermined. The image of Rome was no longer a mirror, it was a warning. But there were always those who remembered enough to ask questions. Travellers who walked ancient roads and wondered why the new ones fell apart so quickly. Architects who studied ruins and realized their own buildings weren't as strong. Scribes who stumbled upon old documents written in languages more precise than their own. And they began to wonder, why did we stop building like this? Why did we stop thinking like this? Who decided we didn't need this anymore? And slowly, the memory began to return, in whispers, in fragments, in rediscovered texts and unearthed ruins. The Renaissance didn't begin with a sudden burst of genius. It began with recovery. It began when people realized that what they were told was the beginning of history was, in fact, a middle chapter. That before the darkness there had been a light so bright it had cast shadows for centuries, and that light was Roman. What was erased can be found again, but only if we ask why it was hidden in the first place. There's power in remembering, power in recognizing that history is not a straight line, that it bends, twists, is edited and rewritten, that those who control the past shape the future. Rome didn't disappear, it was buried, not under ash like Pompeii, but under stories, under lies, under convenience, and now the dust is starting to clear. In the shadow of the Alps, there's a forgotten church, small, quiet, made of stone. Inside it, behind crumbling plaster and centuries of soot, archaeologists found something strange, Roman columns, carved long before the church was built. They had been repurposed, not honoured, not preserved, just reused, as if the memory they carried had no meaning, and that's what happened across Europe. Pieces of Rome weren't displayed like treasures, they were broken apart and reassembled into something new. Statues were shattered and used for lime. Marble from temples became foundation stones for barns, libraries were stripped for kindling, even the bones of old emperors were dug up and scattered, their names scratched off tablets, their legacies scrubbed clean. The question isn't why Rome fell. The question is who wanted it gone so badly they dismantled it in silence. It's easy to say the world moved on, that new rulers, new beliefs, new languages simply replaced the old, but transitions leave traces. And the disappearance of Rome was too clean, too quiet. Its collapse felt more like a decision than a disaster. Somewhere along the way, forgetting became policy. The empire that once built sewers under every city was replaced by towns that threw waste into the street. The civilization that once bathed daily became an age where bathing was discouraged, even feared. Roman medicine, with its surgical tools and understanding of sanitation, gave way to leeches, prayers, and bloodletting, and no one asked why, or if they did, their questions were lost with them. But Rome had left behind something stubborn, architecture, and stone cannot lie. In the heart of Italy, the Pantheon still stands, a dome so perfect that it's been studied for centuries and still confounds architects. No medieval building came close, and yet, for hundreds of years, it sat in quiet neglect. No attempts were made to replicate it, no efforts to teach how it was made. It was as if people were taught to marvel, but not to understand, because understanding leads to remembering, and remembering leads to questions. The narrative that replaced Rome's memory was narrow and convenient. It told of a decadent people brought low by their own pride. It warned that civilization, without divine guidance, would always fail. It insisted that what came after, feudalism, the church's grip, the age of kings, was a step forward, not backward. But the ruins disagreed. They whispered stories of roads that never eroded, bridges that still stood, apartments with running water and radiant heating, public toilets, surgical scalpels, legal documents written with clarity modern lawyers would admire. How does one explain that kind of knowledge simply vanishing? The answer lies in power. Rome was not erased because it failed. It was erased because it remembered too much. It offered a vision of the world where order didn't depend on divine will or royal blood, where citizenship meant something, where people could rise through merit, through law, through knowledge. That vision was incompatible with the feudal world that followed. So it had to be buried, and not just the stones, but the ideas. They closed the libraries and called them pagan. They burned the scrolls and called it purification. They destroyed statues and called it humility. All the while building a new order in the vacuum Rome left behind. But memory is a strange thing. Even buried, it leaves echoes. In a scrap of parchment hidden in a monastery wall. In a recipe for concrete scribbled in the margins of a priest's journal, in a child's game still played on the same tiles Roman children once skipped across. Rome waited, silent but not gone. And one day the silence began to crack. A young scholar wandering through the ruins asked why no one wrote like Cicero anymore. A mason puzzled over the angles in a fallen arch. A traveller from the east carried scrolls long thought lost back into Italy, and slowly, like dawn creeping over a darkened landscape, the world remembered. But the question remains, how much was lost forever? What brilliance died with the scrolls that fed the flames? What cures? What discoveries? What ideas that could have changed the course of history? Had they not been declared heresy? Had they not threatened the order of kings and clergy? Rome didn't just fall, it was taken apart, its greatness buried under layers of fear, control, and narrative. But some fragments survived, enough to remind us that history isn't just what we're told, it's what remains, what we rediscover, and what we dare to remember. There's a Roman bridge in Spain that still carries traffic, not tourists or scholars, just everyday villagers going to work, buying bread, living their lives. The stone is weathered, but the structure holds. It was built 2,000 years ago, without modern machines, without steel, without concrete mixers. It survived floods, wars, earthquakes, and the slow erosion of time. But what it couldn't survive was memory. Ask most who cross it today who built it, and they don't know. Some guess medieval kings, others shrug. The truth is beneath their feet, but not in their minds. That is the quiet tragedy of what was erased. Not just knowledge, but familiarity. Rome became a stranger in its own lands, and maybe that was the plan. Because when you take away someone's history, you don't just take away their past, you take away their potential, their ability to imagine a better future, their sense that they come from something great, that they belong to something bigger. Remove that, and what's left is obedience, silence, an emptiness to be filled by whatever narrative suits the new rulers best. The erasure of Rome wasn't just about ending a chapter, it was about controlling the next one. And it worked, almost. For centuries, people lived among ruins without recognizing them. They harvested crops beside collapsed aqueducts, used shattered temples as sheepfolds, built churches on top of amphitheatres. Rome had become scenery, forgotten yet always present, a ghost in stone. But ghosts have a way of speaking to the curious. In the 15th century, a young man in Florence wandered through the ruins. He studied old texts, traced broken Latin phrases, sketched toppled columns. He wasn't royalty or clergy, he was an artist. His name was Brunelleschi, and what he saw in those ruins changed everything. Inspired by Roman architecture, he designed a dome for the cathedral in Florence, a dome that had baffled engineers for 100 years. He built it without scaffolding, using principles he claimed to have learned from the ancients. No one had built a dome like that since the Pantheon. Suddenly Rome was whispering again, this time louder. That dome became a signal, a crack in the silence, the beginning of what we now call the Renaissance. But it wasn't a rebirth out of nothing, it was a resurrection of Rome. Books hidden in monasteries were brought into the light, Roman law was studied again, sculptors tried to match the old masters, scientists returned to observation and mathematics, the methods once taught in lost Roman academies. Rome wasn't dead, it had simply been sealed off. But here's the cruel irony. The very people who had erased Rome now claimed its legacy. Kings who ruled by divine right started calling themselves emperors. The church adorned itself with columns and arches, and every new ruler, eager to prove their greatness, wrapped themselves in the borrowed robes of a forgotten world. They had spent centuries trying to silence Rome, and now they wanted to speak in its voice. But imitation isn't understanding. They rebuilt the symbols but not the substance. They mimicked the forms, not the functions. Rome's architecture returned, but not its citizenship. Its statues were admired, but not its philosophy. Its greatness was praised, but not its warnings. Because buried deep in Rome's true legacy was a message the new world still didn't want to hear. That power without wisdom crumbles, that law without justice corrupts, that empires without memory repeat the same tragedies again and again. The Renaissance remembered the surface, but the soul of Rome, that remained underground. Even today, we walk through cities shaped by Roman hands. We speak words that came from Latin roots. We live under legal systems that began with Roman law. But do we understand what we've inherited, or have we inherited only the ruins? The erasure may be centuries old, but it's not over. Even now, textbooks simplify Rome's fall into a few neat sentences. Movies depict it as a spectacle of blood and madness. The real story, the erasure, the silence, the deliberate forgetting, that's harder to tell. But if we listen, Rome still speaks, in the rhythm of our streets, in the structure of our thoughts, in the stubborn presence of things too well built to die. There's an old saying among archaeologists: the deeper you dig, the more Rome you find. Beneath medieval churches lie Roman temples. Beneath cobbled streets, Roman sewers. Beneath quiet villages, forgotten Roman towns, their walls and courtyards still traced in stone. It's as if the Middle Ages were built not on the ruins of Rome, but on top of its very skin, layer after layer of history pressed down until the truth could barely breathe, and that pressing down was no accident. In many parts of Europe, Roman sites were deliberately buried, temples were filled with rubble and sealed, forums were paved over, statues were smashed and hidden beneath new foundations. What wasn't burned was buried, and what wasn't buried was explained away with new myths and new meanings. The medieval world didn't want Rome gone, it wanted Rome rewritten. Because Rome told a story that was too dangerous to remember clearly, a story where power wasn't always divine, where laws applied even to rulers, where knowledge was shared, not hoarded. That kind of memory wasn't useful to kings or bishops, so they changed the lens. Rome became a tale of hubris. Its emperors were monsters, its decadence unforgivable, its gods sinful. The empire was cast as a lesson, not a legacy. And slowly, year by year, generation by generation, the memory warped. Even the word Rome began to change. In the East, the Byzantine Empire still called itself Roman for 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell, but in the West, the word came to mean something distant, even dangerous. The people who lived among its ruins were taught not to see them as part of their own story, but as remnants of a dead, godless world. But memory has roots deeper than stone. In secret corners of monasteries, a few brave scribes copied old Roman texts, not because they were ordered to, but because something in those words felt too powerful to lose. They couldn't explain why. They just knew it mattered. A scroll on geometry, a recipe for medicine, a treatise on ethics. Slivers of a world almost forgotten, kept alive by the stubborn few who believed that knowledge itself was sacred, and it wasn't just scribes. In Moorish Spain, scholars translated Roman and Greek texts into Arabic, preserving ideas that had been banned or burned elsewhere. Roman astronomy, medicine, and philosophy lived on, not in the lands where they had been born, but in places willing to protect them. There's a bitter truth in that. Sometimes the guardians of a civilization's memory aren't its heirs, but strangers who recognize its value. And yet, even with pieces preserved, the full picture remained broken. We forgot how Rome governed its cities, how it balanced local and imperial power, how its roads weren't just infrastructure, but arteries of connection. We forgot how its courts worked, how its citizens voted, how its doctors practiced surgery centuries ahead of their time. We remembered the gladiators, the violence, the spectacle, but not the system that held it all together. And maybe that's because systems are harder to mythologize. A Colosseum is easy to admire, but sanitation policy, civil engineering, bureaucratic innovation, those things don't make for grand stories. But they're what made Rome last, and what made it threatening. Because if the average Roman citizen had access to clean water, stable law, and public education, what would that say about the feudal order that came after? Better to bury the knowledge, better to turn the ruins into curiosities, better to keep the people from knowing that once, long ago, life might have been more civilized than they were allowed to believe. But history doesn't sleep forever. Sometimes a child plays in a field and finds a coin with an emperor's face. Sometimes a shepherd stumbles upon a tiled floor in the forest. Sometimes an earthquake splits the earth and reveals an old Roman wall, perfectly preserved, waiting in silence. And in those moments, the illusion fractures. Because if Rome was really as broken and doomed as they say, why does so much of it still stand? The truth is patient. It waits beneath centuries of dust and story. And when it returns, it doesn't shout. It simply reveals itself brick by brick. Imagine standing in a quiet valley somewhere in France. The grass sways gently and a stream cuts through the centre like it always has. To most, it's just countryside, but if you could peel back the earth like a blanket, you'd find something else. Stone foundations, Roman floor mosaics, buried aqueducts. A city once stood here. It had names, laws, bakeries, dreams. Now, not even the locals remember it. Rome's ghost is everywhere. But the strange thing is how quickly that ghost was ignored. Within a few generations of the Western Empire's collapse, people had stopped using Roman roads. Great stone bridges were left to rot. Sewers were blocked, and no one knew how to fix them. Bathhouses that once bustled with thousands fell silent and grew moss. And then came the worst betrayal. They stopped remembering how to read. Latin, once the language of poets and emperors, became the guarded tongue of priests. It wasn't taught, it was locked away. And as the words faded, so did the memory of how the world used to work. It's one thing to lose power, it's another to lose your place in time. This forgetting wasn't accidental, it was engineered. If people couldn't read the old laws, they couldn't compare them to the new ones. If they couldn't understand Roman philosophy, they wouldn't question the divine right of kings. If they didn't know there used to be public voting, clean cities, legal protections, then what they had now, feudal lords, mud streets, arbitrary punishments, would seem normal. And when people forget what they've lost, they stop demanding it back. That's how control works. Not always through swords and chains, sometimes it's through silence, through carefully curated ignorance, through centuries of telling people that this is the way it's always been. But the earth doesn't lie. A Roman town might be forgotten in the books, but dig a few feet down, and there it is. Its layout organised, its engineering precise, its design shockingly modern. You don't need a historian to tell you these people lived differently. You can see it in the stones. Even ruins have language. The arches speak, the plumbing systems whisper, the amphitheatres, still echoing with sound after 1,500 years, ask questions no medieval ruler wanted answered. Who built this? Why did it last? Why don't we build like this anymore? And the answers point to something inconvenient. Because Rome didn't just fall under the weight of barbarian swords or political chaos, that's only part of the tale. What happened after was more deliberate. A choice was made to erase, to overwrite, to rebuild a story that didn't threaten the powers rising from Rome's ashes. We often picture the fall of civilizations as cataclysmic events, fires, invasions, sudden collapse. But sometimes the real erasure is slow, quiet, and oddly polite. A bishop writes a new text and leaves the old one to decay. A noble tears down Roman stones to build his castle. A village changes its name. A scribe copies one version of history and burns another, not out of malice, but convenience, or politics, or fear. And so the narrative shifted, not with a scream, but a shrug. Yet scattered across Europe are places where the old story still pokes through. An arch left standing in a cow field, a Roman wall swallowed by ivy behind a farmhouse, a mile marker, weathered and forgotten, still standing tall. These are not ruins, they are reminders that before the medieval world, before the lords and the plagues and the cathedrals, there was something else, organised, complex, flawed, but astonishing. A civilization that didn't just conquer land, but built systems meant to outlast its emperors. And perhaps they did. Because even in its absence, Rome casts a shadow. It made itself unforgettable, even when forgotten. So the question lingers. If so much of Rome was erased, why does so much still remain? Maybe because the truth always leaves fingerprints. No matter how many times you try to wipe it clean, beneath a cathedral in Trier, Germany, there's a secret. A staircase winds downward into dim stone corridors, until suddenly you're standing in a Roman basilica. It's massive. Columns rise into the dark like ribs from a buried giant. This was once a Roman palace hall, grand, echoing, imperial, and now it's hidden beneath the very institution that replaced it. This is not unique. Across Europe, Christian churches were often built on Roman sites. Shrines stood where temples once rose. Altars now occupy the places where senators once debated. The old gods were buried, literally, under new stories. But look closely and the lines blur. Some saints share suspicious traits with older Roman deities. Some rituals echo festivals that came before them. The clothes changed, the symbols changed, but something ancient was still breathing under the surface. It's as if Rome was too strong to fully erase, so it was absorbed instead. The early medieval world didn't completely abandon Rome. In some cases, it cannibalized it. Roman law was quoted by rulers who barely understood Latin. Old Roman titles were reused like props in a play. Even the Holy Roman Empire, centuries later, was not Roman, not holy, and barely an empire, but it wanted the name, because names have power. By claiming Rome's ghost, new rulers claimed legitimacy. They wanted people to believe they were heirs to something mighty and eternal. Not a new world, but a continuation. But it was a lie wrapped in robes of memory, because the world they governed was not Rome. The roads were broken, the aqueducts were dry, the rights were gone. The civic structure, the citizenship, the voting, the baths, the libraries, all replaced with hierarchy, obedience, and superstition. Rome had become a costume, and everyone was wearing it. And while the elite played dress-up with its symbols, the common people forgot it ever existed. For appease, and ploughing a muddy field in 8th century Gaul, Rome was not just dead, it was myth. The stone ruins were cursed, the stories were confused. Was it giants who built those roads? Pagans? Devils? People had no idea what came before them, because no one told them. And that silence wasn't an accident, because memory, when it serves power, is preserved. When it threatens power, it's rewritten. That's why the fall of Rome wasn't just political, it was informational. The knowledge that held society together, engineering, governance, public health, wasn't passed on, it was locked away, or deemed irrelevant, or quietly destroyed. And as generations passed, the very idea that a better world had once existed faded from memory, but not completely, because even in the darkest centuries, Rome's fingerprints remained. A perfectly straight road cutting through a forest, a buried mosaic found during a plough, coins with faces of emperors no one remembers, symbols, fragments, questions, things that didn't fit the new world. And those fragments whispered something dangerous. What if things were once better? What if the world used to make more sense? It's a haunting idea, and it reveals something unsettling about history itself. That forgetting isn't always passive. Sometimes it's strategic. And remembering, truly remembering, is a form of rebellion. A traveller in the year 750 crossing the ruins of North Africa might have stumbled upon something strange. A Roman city, abandoned yet intact, streets still paved, baths still echoing with silence, statues gazing blankly into wind-blown sand, walls standing yet hollowed of meaning. It was as though time had paused and no one came back to press play. But this wasn't just decay, it was erasure in slow motion. Carthage, once the rival of Rome, then one of its grandest cities, had been reduced to bones and dust, yet the remains were not scavenged for memory, only for stone. Marble was stolen for mosques and fortresses, bricks pulled from colonnades and reused to build something else, something forgetful. A city like Leptis Magna in modern-day Libya, famous for its monumental scale, was swallowed by sand. Entire amphitheatres, libraries, marketplaces, buried not just by the elements, but by the indifference of time. No grand war destroyed it, No cataclysm announced its fall. It simply faded, uncelebrated, unremembered. But the sands were not the only culprit. The shift was deeper, cultural, spiritual, almost psychological. As Islam spread across North Africa, it brought new language, new law, new ways of seeing the world, and with it came a purposeful distancing from the Roman past. That distancing was not always violent, it was subtle. A new architecture rose, not to destroy the Roman world, but to cover it. Domes where arches once stood, minarets replacing columns, a quiet turning of the page. And that might seem like a natural evolution, but buried within it was something else, a cleansing of memory. In Byzantium, the last flickering light of Roman order in the East, the process was slower, but no less tragic. There, emperors still called themselves Romans. They still governed by Roman law. They still wore the purple robes, but they spoke Greek. They fought civil wars. They betrayed their own, and as plague and fire and siege wore them down, their Rome became more fantasy than fact. By the time Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the last echo of Rome was gone. But the West didn't wait for that end. It had already buried Rome centuries earlier. Monks in monasteries, copying scrolls by candlelight, made decisions, what to preserve and what to ignore. Which pagan authors were too dangerous to survive? Which texts were worth translating? Which ideas felt too close to freedom? And in those decisions, vast swaths of Roman wisdom vanished. Not with flames, but with silence. The ancient medical texts that once cured the sick, lost. The architectural treatises that taught how to build domes and aqueducts, forgotten. The political discourses that encouraged debate and citizenship, replaced by obedience and divine rule. This was not chaos, it was design. And it brings us to a question history rarely dares to ask. What if the fall of Rome wasn't just about what was destroyed, but what was allowed to disappear? Imagine a world where medicine had advanced 1,000 years sooner, where public health, city planning, and democratic thought had not been locked away, where the wheel of progress had not been turned back. But someone, somewhere, made a choice to start over, to unlearn. And when the wheel stopped turning, it was Rome that was beneath it. Not a civilization that crumbled, but one that was covered, intentionally, methodically, until only the bones remained. Beneath the green hills of England, tucked in shadowed earth, lie remnants of something ancient, something Roman, bathhouses now turned to ruin, mosaic floors kissed by moss. A shrine to Sulis Minerva, once vibrant with offerings, now hollow and cracked. But in the centuries that followed the Roman retreat, few even knew what these ruins were. The Saxons who moved into these lands saw the stone foundations as the work of giants, literal giants. Their myths spoke of ancient titans building these mysterious structures, not human engineers. That wasn't ignorance, it was amnesia. The kind of forgetting that stretches generations, then hardens into folklore. The stories of Roman Britain, its cities, roads, temples, and garrisons, didn't just vanish, they were overwritten. Saxon kings took over Roman forts without knowing who built them. Churches rose where temples once stood. The great Roman roads were still walked upon, but no longer maintained. And slowly, like a ghost walking among the living, Rome faded into a legend. But if Rome disappeared from the land, it was erased even more violently from the mind. In the halls of rising Christian kingdoms, there was no place for the memory of Rome's plural gods, its democratic experiments, or its philosophy of balance between state and citizen. These ideas were not just forgotten, they were scrubbed out. One chronicler in the 8th century wrote of the Romans as if they were a species apart, distant, decadent, doomed by their own pride. But what he failed to say was that the very language he wrote in, the calendar he followed, the roads he travelled, all were gifts from Rome. This was the paradox of the post-Roman world. The kingdoms that replaced it, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, feared the shadow of the empire even as they built atop its bones. Charlemagne would later call himself the new Caesar, yet few of his subjects could even read the inscriptions left behind by the old one. By the time the Renaissance whispered its way into Europe, painters and poets were gazing at broken statues and crumbling temples with awe, but not understanding. They called it rediscovery, a rebirth, as if Rome had simply been sleeping. But Rome wasn't sleeping, it had been buried alive. The ruins hadn't just collapsed, they had been ignored. Roman scrolls weren't misplaced, they were thrown out. Libraries weren't burned by accident, they were neglected by choice. And behind this forgetting was something powerful: fear. Because to remember Rome was to remember a world not ruled by divine right, a world of engineers and orators, a world of laws made by men, not handed down from heavens. That kind of memory was dangerous to kings and bishops alike. So it had to be erased, and in its place they told a different story. A story where light came only with faith, where everything before was darkness, where the empire was a cautionary tale, not a foundation. But the earth never forgets. Centuries later, farmers would plough their fields and strike stone, Roman walls just beneath the soil. Shepherds would rest beneath trees growing out of old forums, and children would find coins in the dirt, marked with the faces of emperors they never learned about in school. The memory of Rome was not gone, it had simply been silenced. Yet every broken column, every hidden inscription, every lost manuscript whispered a different truth. That Rome had not simply fallen, it had been erased, and the erasure was not the work of time, but of men. In the cold silence of the Alps, Roman legions once marched with banners held high. They carved roads through mountains, built way stations in the snow, and left behind inscriptions marking their triumphs. But centuries later, when weary pilgrims climbed those same icy paths, they walked over broken stones without knowing what lay beneath. They were not told of the empire that once bridged that wilderness with civilization. Instead, they were told only of saints and miracles. The deeper you look into medieval Europe, the more you begin to notice the gaps, not just what was remembered, but what was deliberately not. The name Rome still echoed in chants and in church Latin, but the true meaning had faded. Few could read Cicero or Tacitus. Even fewer could rebuild an aqueduct or explain the legal codes that once held provinces together. What remained was a ghost of the empire, haunting the architecture and language, but stripped of its soul. In monasteries, monks copied texts, but only the ones deemed worthy. Pages of ancient science, medicine, or philosophy were scraped clean and overwritten with hymns. Sometimes in the right light, the old ink would shine faintly through, a palimpsest of knowledge lost beneath layers of piety. The erasure was both physical and spiritual. The early church didn't just want to convert Rome, it wanted to replace it. The grandeur of Roman law, the complexity of its politics, the skepticism of its thinkers, these were seen as threats, so they became warnings instead of lessons. Pagan, they said, like a scarlet letter stamped on all that had come before. But not everyone forgot. In hidden corners of Europe, in Arab libraries and Byzantine vaults, fragments of Roman knowledge were preserved. Mathematicians in Baghdad were reading Galen and Ptolemy when Paris thought the world was flat. In Constantinople, emperors still called themselves Roman, even as the Western world labelled them something else, Greeks, as if that made them easier to forget. And that's the strange truth. Rome never really disappeared. It was renamed, rewritten, hidden behind new banners and new languages. The Holy Roman Empire, for example, neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire, claimed the legacy while discarding its essence. Even the Renaissance, hailed as the grand rediscovery of classical thought, was merely a flicker of what had once been a roaring flame. Because by then the damage was done. Whole generations had lived and died in a world where Rome was a shadow, where concrete was a lost art, where senators were remembered as sinners, not statesmen, where democracy was a curiosity, not a right. It's easy to say that Rome fell. But what really happened is more unsettling. Rome was slowly, methodically dismantled from the mind, not by war but by silence, not by fire but by forgetting. And as the centuries passed, the world was rebuilt, not upon the ashes of Rome but beside them, as if afraid that to build directly upon that foundation might awaken something powerful, a memory too strong, a truth too inconvenient. So the empire was erased, not just in buildings or scrolls, but in thought, and in its place a simpler story was told, one that served kings, one that served priests, one that kept the world small. But beneath that story, beneath every cathedral and cobbled road, the bones of Rome still lie waiting to be remembered. In a quiet church in Ravenna, the walls glitter with gold, mosaics shimmer in candlelight, angels, emperors, saints. But look closer, and you'll notice something strange. The figures wear Roman robes, their sandals are Roman, the arches above them are Roman, yet no one calls them Romans anymore. What happened in Ravenna happened across all of Europe. The shell of Rome was kept, its style, its symbols, even its language, in fragments. But the substance, the thinking, the civic pride, the restless pursuit of law and reason, that was slowly peeled away. The new world wanted the image of Rome, not its soul. And perhaps the most haunting example of that is the way time itself was rewritten. In ancient Rome, calendars tracked the founding of the city. Months were named after emperors. Years were marked by consuls. Time was measured by human achievement, by the rhythm of political life. But in the Middle Ages, time became sacred. The calendar was taken from the emperors and handed to the saints. History was bent around the birth of Christ, and everything before it was labelled as a time of darkness or of sin. The old reckoning was discarded, like a broken clock too dangerous to fix. This wasn't just a shift in measurement, it was a shift in meaning. The past no longer existed to be studied, it existed to be judged. Rome was cast as decadent, godless, a warning against pride. Its philosophers were rebranded as fools, its scientists as heretics, its heroes as pagans who had it coming. Children learned not about Cato or Cicero, but about martyrs and miracles, and slowly, generation by generation, Rome became a rumour. A city that had once ruled the known world became a cautionary tale in dusty manuscripts. Its laws, once the bedrock of civilization, became arcane whispers in monastery halls. Its language, once spoken from Britannia to Babylon, became a language only the clergy could read, and even then, barely. But erasure is rarely perfect. In the remote highlands of Wales, stories of Roman roads lingered in folk songs. In the hills of Provence, farmers ploughed up coins stamped with forgotten emperors. In Spain, aqueducts still carried water, though few could say who built them. Rome had been erased from memory, but not from the earth. Its ruins stood like ghosts, too large to ignore, too broken to explain. So they were folded into myth. At Hadrian's Wall, locals spoke of giants. In the forums, they said demons had once walked. When they could no longer understand Rome, they turned it into legend. But even legends have power. That's what made the Renaissance so dangerous to those who had built their kingdoms atop the ruins. When thinkers like Petrarch and Dante began peering into dusty texts and asking questions, something stirred. Ancient manuscripts smuggled from Byzantium, mathematical tables from the Arab world, translations of Aristotle and Vitruvius, all of it started to pull the curtain back. They began to realize the enormity of what had been lost, and more importantly, what had been taken. Because the further they looked, the clearer it became. Rome didn't fall, it had been buried, intentionally, under superstition, under doctrine, under fear. And the moment people began to see through it, just a little, the world began to change again. They started to build cathedrals with domes, not unlike the Pantheon. They debated ideas in public squares, as if the Forum had returned. They carved statues that no longer bowed their heads, but looked out with quiet pride. The Roman spirit wasn't dead, it had just been sleeping, waiting beneath layers of erasure, waiting for someone to ask, what really happened here? A quiet revolution was taking place in dusty libraries and candlelit studies. Across Europe, men and women began to find scraps, old scrolls, forgotten tomes, fragments of parchment that had somehow survived the centuries of silence. Some were buried in monastery basements, others hidden behind newer texts used as bindings, or scraped and overwritten in desperation during times of war. But underneath the surface, beneath the sermons and saints, there were echoes, words of Cicero, sketches of Vitruvius, formulas of Galen, thoughts of Pliny, fragments of lost Rome. And when people began to piece them together, something remarkable happened. It was as if the buried voice of Rome began to whisper again. They discovered that Rome had been far more than swords and soldiers. It had been a mind, a way of thinking, a method of arguing, questioning, building, solving, a culture that did not ask permission to look at the stars or ask what makes a law just. And that realization sent a quiet shiver through the kingdoms that had claimed to inherit the earth. Because if Rome had not fallen, but had been deliberately obscured, what else had been rewritten? The scribes of the Middle Ages had not merely forgotten, they had chosen. They had copied some texts and burned others. They had lifted saints into eternity and dragged emperors into hell. They decided who mattered and who didn't. And in doing so, they shaped not only memory, but identity. To uncover Rome was to risk unravelling everything. Imagine standing in a room filled with paintings, all dimmed by centuries of smoke and dust. You scrape away a corner and find colour, vivid, brilliant, alive. That was the experience of the early humanists. They didn't just study Rome, they felt it. They saw in its ruins not just stones but instructions. They weren't looking at the past. They were touching a future that had been denied to them. This tea reified the powers of the day, because if Roman thought, its law, its architecture, its skepticism, its freedom of speech could be revived, then so too could Rome's challenge to tyranny. Kings ruled by divine right. The church claimed infallibility. But Rome had once thrived on debate, on vote, on the idea that no one, no matter how high, was above reason, and that idea was like fire in dry grass. The Renaissance wasn't a rebirth, it was a recovery from amnesia, and what it revealed was staggering. Not only had Rome shaped Europe, but Europe had done everything it could to forget that. The erasure wasn't accidental, it had a purpose. A continent broken by war, famine, and fear could be controlled more easily if it saw itself as born from darkness rather than as the rightful heir to a vast, complicated civilization. It's easier to rule people who think they've always been peasants than those who remember they were once citizens. And so, the erasure of Rome wasn't just about forgetting temples and aqueducts. It was about breaking a lineage. The Renaissance reopened that bloodline. But the world wasn't ready to admit it. So they celebrated Michelangelo, but not the statue's Roman pose. They praised the dome of St. Peter's, but not its Roman inspiration. They embraced the calendar, but refused to acknowledge the empire that had created the structure of months and days. It was a quiet hypocrisy, one that whispered through the marble halls of Florence, through the corridors of the Vatican, through the courts of France and Spain. The ghost of Rome had returned, but only as a guest, not as a king. And yet, even as it haunted the West, it began to awaken something else, a hunger for clarity, for truth, for a past that didn't begin in darkness, but had been pushed into it. Rome was calling again, not from the top of a throne, but from beneath the dust. There's something unsettling about walking through a Roman ruin. The broken columns, shattered statues, and empty amphitheatres don't feel like simple leftovers. They feel like survivors, like they're still trying to speak, even after centuries of silence. And if you listen closely, not just with your ears but with your imagination, you begin to sense it. This wasn't supposed to be rubble. This was supposed to still be alive. And maybe, in a strange way, it still is. Not in marble or mortar, but in ideas that refused to die. Even as Rome was being erased from the surface, its foundations were buried deeper than any ruler could reach. You see it in the roads that still guide our cities, in the laws that still shape our justice systems, in the calendars that still mark our days. But those pieces only survive because some refused to let them vanish. And those people were often rebels, scholars who disobeyed, scribes who copied forbidden texts in candlelight, travellers who smuggled ancient books across borders, artists who painted Roman gods in Christian disguise, architects who studied crumbling aqueducts, not out of nostalgia, but to learn how to build again. They were not trying to relive the past, they were trying to unlock it. Because the truth was, the fall of Rome had never truly ended, it had simply gone underground, and every time someone chipped away at the illusion of the so-called Dark Ages, a little more of that hidden truth came into view. By the time the printing press arrived, the dam had cracked. Books once hoarded in monasteries began to flow freely. Translations of Cicero, Virgil, Lucretius, each one a key to a door long shut. And behind those doors was a world that didn't fit the narrative of eternal piety and divine hierarchy. It was messy, curious, human, it was Roman. But this sudden access terrified the old order, because once people could read Rome, for themselves they started asking dangerous questions. Why did the church burn so many texts? Why had kings hidden knowledge behind walls of Latin? Why had we been taught that nothing of value existed before Christ, when so much of our civilization was built by those who came before? The answers were never simple, but the mere act of asking pulled at the threads of power. And beneath those threads, more ghosts stirred. There were women who had written philosophy, now long erased. Engineers who had designed machines that wouldn't be seen again for 1,000 years. Doctors who had mapped the human body with a clarity the Middle Ages refused to replicate. The question wasn't just, why did Rome fall? It became, who made sure we forgot how much it gave us? And the deeper people dug, the clearer it became. Forgetting Rome wasn't an accident, it was policy. Entire generations had been trained to see it as distant, pagan, irrelevant. Yet here it was, speaking across time with a voice more vivid than the kings who tried to silence it. Rome had become a mirror, and in that mirror the world saw both what it had lost and what it could become again. But not everyone welcomed that reflection. Some clung tighter to the veil, afraid of what full memory might reveal. Because remembering Rome didn't just mean honouring the past, it meant questioning the present. It always starts quietly, a phrase in a forgotten manuscript, a broken statue unearthed by a farmer's plough, a crumbling inscription half buried in the walls of a cathedral. Little pieces, little echoes, but each one stirs something, and soon the silence begins to fracture. In the great courts of Europe, thinkers started whispering dangerous thoughts, that maybe the ancients weren't primitive at all, that maybe there had been a golden age of logic, of medicine, of architecture, long before the church had named itself the sole guardian of truth. And slowly, that whisper grew into a roar. It was the beginning of what we now call the Renaissance. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just a rediscovery of pretty art and old books. It was a revolt against centuries of imposed ignorance, a cultural jailbreak, and at the centre of that jailbreak was Rome, not the empire, the idea. Because what the Renaissance truly did was pick up the pieces that had been deliberately scattered. Artists studied Roman anatomy to reclaim the human form. Architects rebuilt domes lost to memory using Vitruvius as their guide. Mathematicians pored over Latin translations of Greek works preserved by Arab scholars. Ironically, the very knowledge Europe had tried to erase was returned to it by the people they once called infidels. It was a cosmic irony. The knowledge Rome had once protected, Europe had tried to bury. But the world had a longer memory than its rulers expected. Rome came back, not in legions or laws, but in questions, in curiosity, in courage. The Renaissance was, in many ways, an act of revenge, not against people, but against the forgetting. It was a resurrection, not of gods or emperors, but of reason, of beauty, of possibility. But even this rebirth had enemies. There were those who feared where it would lead. After all, if the people could learn that Rome was once filled with libraries, and democracy and scientists who charted the stars, what else might they begin to question? The Church responded by doubling down. The Inquisition burned books as quickly as they were printed. Scholars were imprisoned. Heretics were tortured. Galileo was forced to deny the very heavens he had mapped because his telescope didn't fit the narrative. But the damage was already done. Rome had re-entered the bloodstream of Europe, quietly, persistently. It began to haunt art, literature, politics. Kings began calling themselves Caesars again. Republics were whispered of in coffee houses. Philosophers dreamed of a world built not on divine command, but on natural law. Rome was no longer just a ruin. It was a blueprint, and in that blueprint lay an unspoken threat, because it suggested that power didn't have to look like a throne, that glory didn't have to come from God, that progress didn't need permission. This scared the old world, because Rome was a reminder that civilization could rise without them. And so they tried again to tame it, to reduce it to a chapter in a book, a museum behind glass, to turn its vibrance into marble, its voices into echoes, its failures into warnings. But the truth had already slipped through their fingers. Rome was alive again, not in palaces or cathedrals, but in minds. The war was no longer about empires, it was about memory. There's something quietly terrifying about forgotten things, because they don't stay buried forever. Beneath the polished floors of European cathedrals and the layers of medieval dust, archaeologists began uncovering bones that didn't match the stories, aqueducts that stretched farther than textbooks claimed, roads that ran straighter than the kings who ruled above them, ruins that whispered of technologies no one admitted existed. It was no longer just about memory, it was about contradiction. Rome had not been a flickering light snuffed out by chaos. It had been a blazing star, intentionally dimmed, and every brick unearthed proved it. Scholars puzzled over collapsed bathhouses with underfloor heating systems more advanced than what existed in 17th century London. Engineers studied Roman concrete that had withstood centuries of salt and storms, stronger than what modern cities could manage. They began to ask dangerous questions. How could such mastery vanish? The answer was equally dangerous. It hadn't vanished. It had been buried, systematically, thoroughly, and with remarkable precision. The rise of feudal kingdoms, the silence of monasteries, the smoke from inquisitorial fires, these weren't just the natural progression of history. They were part of an erasure, a carefully orchestrated campaign not just to forget Rome, but to rewrite it. Because Rome had proven something unsettling, that people could govern themselves, that law didn't have to come from God or crown, that knowledge belonged to everyone, and that was the problem. Because if the people knew that once, long ago, streets were clean, medicine was logical, buildings were resilient, and debates were open, then what excuse could the new powers possibly offer? So they didn't explain, they concealed. Medieval scholars altered timelines, suggesting the fall of Rome had brought salvation, that the barbaric era had been necessary to cleanse the sins of an empire too proud, too pagan, too free-thinking. The empire's complexity was reduced to caricature, gladiators, orgies, corruption. But the artifacts told another story, a story of public education, of legal systems that could be appealed, of libraries filled with texts that didn't just survive, they thrived. The deeper historians dug, the more they found Rome's fingerprints everywhere, not just in marble ruins, but in systems of law, in city planning, in philosophical thought. Even the languages we speak carry Latin's bones beneath them. Rome hadn't fallen. It had been fractured, scattered like seeds, hoping no one would notice as it sprouted beneath their feet. And slowly, painfully, the world began to notice. Not in dramatic revolutions at first, but in subtle rebellions. A student quoting Cicero in defiance of a priest. A mason rebuilding a dome based on ancient blueprints. A midwife recalling Roman texts on childbirth banned by the church. A pulse returning to a corpse long thought cold. Rome never needed resurrection. It needed permission. And once that permission was granted, once the illusion cracked wide enough for light to slip through, its voice returned, not as thunder, but as a whisper too persistent to ignore, because the greatest empire in human history was never truly erased. It was just waiting for someone to remember. The Renaissance didn't start with a trumpet blast, it started with a book. A dusty, brittle manuscript hidden on a monastery shelf, written in Latin no one had dared speak out loud for centuries. Not Holy Latin, the rigid, stripped-down version allowed by the Church, but classical Latin, Roman Latin, bold, human, dangerous. The book was De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, written by Lucretius, a Roman poet and philosopher who had vanished into the fog of time. His words were secular, even scandalous. He spoke of atoms, of logic over fear, of a universe not ruled by divine punishment, but by natural law. And that manuscript, found by accident in the 1400s, cracked something open. Suddenly the silence wasn't enough. Questions began to flood back in. Why had Rome's ideas been hidden? Why had reason been replaced with blind obedience? Why did it feel like the future was buried in the past? That single scroll inspired thinkers across Europe. Artists, architects, philosophers, they all turned toward the ruins, not as crumbling relics, but as blueprints. Florence began to rise on Roman shoulders, domes curved again like they had over the Pantheon, roads stretched straighter, the human form returned to canvas, not as a sinful object, but as a thing of beauty, worthy of study. This wasn't nostalgia, it was reawakening. The Renaissance wasn't about discovering something new, it was about remembering something old. Rome had left its legacy in code, in marble, in words, in buried aqueducts, and now that code was being decrypted. But the erasure had been deep. Some things remained lost, others were only half remembered, twisted by centuries of fear. And the forces that once tried to bury Rome weren't finished yet, they just wore new robes. Political power still feared knowledge, churches still warned against questioning too much, kings still preferred citizens who obeyed, not ones who read Cicero. But the dam had cracked. The printing press helped widen the breach. Roman texts were copied not by monks in candlelight, but by machines that spat out pages faster than priests could condemn them. Suddenly, the masses had access to words once reserved for the elite, and in those words were ideas, Rome had planted long ago. Freedom, justice, reason. Of course, not everyone saw this as progress. To some, the revival of Rome's voice felt like blasphemy. They warned of decadence returning, of pagan corruption infecting Christian hearts, but it was too late. Rome had waited long enough. The whispers turned to conversation, conversation to debate, debate to revolution, and even then, even centuries after its so-called fall, Rome's shadow loomed. The United States modelled its Senate on Roman institutions. European legal systems bore Roman fingerprints. Cities revived Roman planning, Roman stonework, Roman dreams. But most people still didn't know. They saw the ruins, they took photos, they walked where emperors walked, but they didn't realise the full story, that Rome wasn't destroyed by barbarians or by sin. It was erased. And yet, even erasure has limits, because an idea, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. And Rome was never just a place. It was an idea waiting patiently for the world to remember. The men who ruled the shadows knew something the people didn't. Memory could be dangerous. Not just memory of names or dates, but memory of systems, of rights, of freedom. Rome had built a civilization where citizens debated laws in the forum, where roads stitched empires together, where knowledge was copied, translated, and shared. It was far from perfect, but it was alive, loud, messy, human. And that terrified the silence makers. They had spent centuries not just burying Rome, but reshaping it into myth, turning a flesh and blood republic into a fable, with marble saints and fire-breathing emperors. They blurred the details, hoping no one would notice the pattern. But the pattern was still there. Roman concrete still held up bridges. Roman law still guided courts. Latin still clung to every priest's tongue. The empire was gone, but its bones remained, just beneath the surface, like a fossil waiting to be unearthed. Every time someone tried to revive it, to really understand it, the gatekeepers intervened. They warned against curiosity. They rebranded Roman logic as dangerous arrogance. They portrayed the empire as a lesson in what happens when humans rise too high. But curiosity doesn't die, it just hides, in secret libraries, in whispered conversations, in paintings that looked suspiciously Roman, in architects who copied the old archways, and mathematicians who used old Roman measurements, as if they never disappeared. And then came the travellers, merchants, pilgrims, wanderers, young men on their grand tours. They walked the ruined streets of Rome, sketched the crumbling columns, asked questions the guides couldn't answer. Why did they build like this? Why can't we? Why did this vanish? And slowly they began to suspect it didn't vanish. It was pushed. It was rewritten. The empire's corpse was posed to look like it had simply decayed, but the truth was messier and far more deliberate. Rome had been copied by its enemies, its titles stolen, its myths twisted. Charlemagne called himself Emperor of Rome, but ruled with the sword, not the Senate. Popes wore Caesar's robes, but burned anyone who read like Cicero. The truth had been traded for a symbol, and that symbol, Rome, was hollowed out and filled with whatever power needed. But cracks were forming in the shell. Historians began to cross-reference. Archaeologists dug deeper. Libraries turned up letters, census documents, mundane receipts from Roman merchants that didn't match the myths. Rome wasn't just grandeur and gladiators, it was infrastructure, literacy, diplomacy, a system where a farmer in Gaul could send a complaint to a magistrate and expect a response, a world where poor boys could rise to power through merit, not birthright. And that world had been wiped from the chalkboard. Why? Because it was a threat to kings who wanted to be seen as divine, to churches that demanded total obedience, to regimes that thrived on forgetting. If the people remembered Rome, not just as a place, but as a possibility, they might start asking dangerous questions. Questions like, why can't we build roads that last 1,000 years? Or, why are we told to obey instead of speak? Or, what else has been hidden? Rome, even in ruin, offered a blueprint, not a perfect one, but a provocation, a dare, a whisper that said, you were more than serfs, you were citizens once, and maybe you could be again. That whisper echoed across the centuries, sometimes barely audible, sometimes roaring, but always there, because you can erase stone, you can burn scrolls, you can silence tongues, but you can't kill an idea once it's remembered, and Rome, real Rome, was starting to be remembered. There's something eerie about walking through the ruins of Rome, not because of ghosts, but because of the silence, the kind that makes you realize this place wasn't meant to be quiet. You see those stones, half buried under grass and time, and you feel it. The footsteps that once echoed here, the heated arguments of the Senate, the noise of carts rolling over cobblestone, the thousands of voices that once filled these streets like a river of sound. Now there's wind and tourists and the occasional crow. But the silence isn't just time's doing, it was imposed. When the empire cracked, those who took its place wanted the noise gone. They feared what it represented, a city that had once belonged to its people, a republic, however flawed, where debate could shake a palace, a culture where architecture and philosophy were tools of the public good, not just royal decoration. So they turned it all into myth. They painted Rome as a cautionary tale, a beast slain by its own pride. Decadence, they said, vanity, the wrath of God. But not once did they mention the hunger that followed, the darkness, the forgotten skills, the illiteracy, the famines worsened by collapsed roads, the diseases that spread through towns no longer cleaned by aqueducts. No, they said Rome deserved to fall, and in saying that, they gave themselves permission to rule differently, to rule by fear, to hoard knowledge, to flatten culture into one language, one religion, one way of seeing the world. But the stones still whispered. Sometimes a monk would copy a Roman text by candlelight, not fully understanding what he preserved. Sometimes a scholar in Byzantium would translate Aristotle, passing it eastward before it could be burned. Sometimes a peasant would dig up a coin with Caesar's face and wonder who this crowned man without a halo was. History has a strange way of hiding in plain sight, a column reuse. D in a cathedral. A Roman bathhouse turned into a monastery cellar. A military manual passed from empire to empire, its tactics unchanged. The bones of Rome were everywhere, if you knew how to see them. And then came the rediscovery. The whispers became conversations. Petrarch found Cicero's letters. Architects studied the Pantheon and gasped at what had been built without modern tools. Artists saw proportion, symmetry, balance, and knew this wasn't savagery. It was something more advanced than their present. The Renaissance wasn't a beginning, it was a remembering. And memory is dangerous to those who rule by amnesia. As scholars read deeper, they found inconsistencies, gaps, things that didn't add up. Rome didn't collapse overnight. Its eastern half survived 1,000 years after the western fell. The last Roman emperor in the east died less than a century before Columbus sailed west. How could that be? If Rome had fallen into darkness, it hadn't fallen. It had been slowly erased, painted over piece by piece, like a fresco covered in whitewash. But enough of the old image bled through the cracks. Enough remained for a new generation to ask, what if the world we lost was better than the one we were told replaced it? What if progress didn't always march forward? What if someone, somewhere, benefited from forgetting? That question lingered like smoke, and it changed everything. Because once you start to remember Rome, not the myths, but the mechanisms, you start to wonder what else was taken, what else was hidden, what futures were lost in that engineered forgetting. Rome didn't just fall, it was buried beneath centuries of fear, and now it's up to us to dig. You can tell a lot about a civilization by how it keeps time. Rome had calendars so precise they influenced how we measure days even now. They had sundials, water clocks, and legal hours that shifted with the sun. Their festivals were carefully timed with the stars. Seasons were marked with ceremony, harvests calculated, and the rhythm of life beat with a measured civic pulse. But after Rome, time broke. Suddenly, the year wasn't ruled by law or astronomy, it was ruled by saints and shadows. The months blurred, the hours no longer guided by civil duty, but by church bells ringing out prayers. Midnight meant matins, noon meant sext. Calendars shrank from astronomical to theological, and with it, so did the scope of thought. The past was no longer a record of what humans had built. It became a cautionary tale about what happens when they try to build without divine permission. And the deeper you look into this shift, the more deliberate it feels. The people who rose in Rome's place didn't just ignore the empire's intellectual legacy. They rewrote it, or buried it, or made it suspect. Astronomy became astrology. Philosophy was filtered through dogma. Engineering became forgotten magic. The men who once debated ethics in marble halls were recast as pagans, idolaters, or worse, blasphemers. Even the Latin language, once the vehicle of law and poetry, was hijacked, not lost, just locked behind monastery doors. Ordinary people no longer spoke it. They couldn't read the texts, couldn't question what was written, couldn't know what had come before. And that was the point. Because erasing Rome wasn't just about toppling statues or forgetting emperors, it was about severing a lineage of knowledge, about taking the ideas that gave people power, ideas like civic duty, public debate, universal law, and turning them into relics. Rome had flaws, deep ones, brutal ones, but it also had fray, me-works that frightened the rulers of the Dark Ages. A republic, even a broken one, was a dangerous memory. A road that stretched across continents was a threat when you wanted your peasants to stay put. A city where the bathhouse, the theatre, the forum, and the library stood side by side was dangerous when you wanted to control not just where people went, but what they thought. So they rewrote the idea of civilization. They said Rome was decadent, that the baths were sinful, that the theatres were distractions, that debate led to corruption, and in doing so, they rewrote the very meaning of progress. They told the people, you are not descending, you are being saved. But saved from what? From roads, from clean water, from medicine and law and architecture, or from the idea that power didn't have to be divine? As the centuries passed, those questions grew louder, because buried in Europe's soil was the memory of something more organised, more curious, more advanced. And even if they couldn't read the inscriptions, the ruins themselves were proof. Stone arches that still stood after 1,000 years, sewers that still drained cities, tombs that whispered names forgotten by kings but remembered by stone. Rome had not vanished. It had simply been painted over by those who feared its light. And slowly, people began to scrape away the paint. They unearthed columns, dusted off scrolls, whispered names like Cicero, Seneca, Galen, not as devils, but as men who once lit torches in the dark. And with each rediscovery, the lie began to fray. Not because someone confessed to the erasure, but because memory has gravity, and even when buried, Rome's memory pulled the future back toward its orbit. It started with fragments, a carved inscription pulled from a farmer's field, a crumbling aqueduct no one remembered how to build, a name, Vitruvius, Marcus Aurelius, Pliny, etched into brittle manuscripts kept in damp monastery corners. And at first, they didn't know what they were looking at. To them, it was all ancient, foreign, maybe even suspicious, but something about it kept drawing people back. A strange kind of hunger grew, not just for artifacts, but for understanding. Who were these people who carved stone like butter? Who built roads straighter than a king's sword? Who spoke in such precise, ordered language, and believed so deeply in reason, virtue, law? At some point, curiosity began to outweigh fear. And that's when the dam started to crack. Across Europe, whispers turned into research. Latin was no longer just the language of the church. It became the key to unlocking a forgotten world. Scholars emerged, dusty and wide-eyed, translating scrolls with trembling fingers. And what they found didn't fit the story they'd been told. Rome wasn't just blood and conquest. It was observation, medicine, engineering, philosophy. It was men and women recording the stars, cataloguing plants, mapping rivers, weighing ethics, and designing cities with sewage systems more efficient than anything they currently had. It was order in a time that had learned to thrive in chaos. It wasn't long before someone asked the question no one had dared. If they could do this, then why can't we now? That question echoed louder with every discovery, and the answer, though unspoken, became clear, because someone wanted it forgotten. It wasn't nature that buried Rome, it was choice. The roads didn't vanish, they were simply allowed to rot. The books weren't all burned by accident, they were neglected, locked up, dismissed. The technology wasn't lost in the wind, it was declared pagan, heretica, irrelevant. Even the language of Rome, once the tongue of empire, was turned into a sacred riddle, a tool only the elite could wield, not because it was impossible to teach, but because it was dangerous to share. But history has a strange way of breathing under the weight of silence. In Italy, men began sculpting again, not just saints, but Caesars. In France, architects built cathedrals inspired by Roman arches. In England, they dug up coins with unfamiliar emperors and started to wonder about timelines that didn't match the churches. Even in the darkest parts of Europe, the bones of Rome began to glow. And with that glow came the return of a forbidden word, Renaissance. But this wasn't just a rebirth of art, it was the return of memory, of pride not just in faith, but in reason, in human achievement, in asking questions that didn't end with divine will. And for the first time in 1,000 years, people looked backward, not in fear, but with admiration. Rome wasn't erased completely. It had survived, barely, under layers of dust and doctrine. But the hands that once tried to erase it hadn't counted on one thing, that human beings are builders. And even when you knock down their towers, burn their books, silence their teachers, they remember. Not always in words, sometimes in stone, sometimes in song, sometimes in the questions children ask when they see a crumbling bridge that still stands stronger than anything modern. Who built this? Why don't we build like that anymore? Those questions were the match, and with them Rome began to burn again, not in flames of destruction, but of illumination. The most astonishing thing wasn't just what had been buried, but how much of it had survived, clinging to the edges of memory like vines curling around a fallen column. In quiet corners of Europe, craftsmen still built using techniques passed down without knowing their origin. A stonemason in southern France shaped arches with precision that echoed Vitruvian ratios, though he'd never heard the name. A blacksmith in rural Spain used a water wheel mechanism nearly identical to those found in ancient Roman mills. The remnants had lived on, not in libraries or royal courts, but in the hands of the common folk, in methods, in habits, in the whispered tricks of tradespeople. The body of Rome had been broken, but its soul, that had hidden in plain sight. And then, slowly, deliberately, the soul began to return to the mind. Not all at once, not in glory, but in glimmers. Maps redrawn to show old Roman borders. Copies of Cicero and Seneca passed from hand to trembling hand. Glassmakers experimenting with clarity again. Doctors remembering the pulse, the humours, the old diagnoses no longer whispered as heresy. Europe wasn't leaping forward, it was circling back. Because you can't build a future when you've forgotten how your ancestors built theirs. And Rome, in all its ruined majesty, offered something intoxicating. The idea that man could be great without being divine, that roads could outlast kings, that laws could outlive empires, that knowledge could be a kind of immortality. That idea was dangerous. Because if people truly believed it, if they understood that human achievement didn't need to be stamped out in favour of obedience, then the systems built on silence would start to shake, and they did. The church, once the sole gatekeeper of memory, began to lose its grip, not because people stopped believing, but because they started remembering. They remembered aqueducts that had art clean water without prayer. They remembered amphitheatres that gathered people in joy, not fear. They remembered poets who wrote not to convert, but to understand. And as they remembered, they began to wonder what else had been taken. Artists painted not only saints but thinkers. Writers stopped copying texts and began questioning them. Travellers followed old Roman roads not to pilgrimage sites, but to ruins, to pieces of the past that refused to be silent. Even the word Rome began to shift. It wasn't just a city anymore. It was a symbol, a ghost that refused to be forgotten. And as that ghost stretched out its limbs, Europe began to wake up. First in Florence, then Venice, then beyond. Not with violence or rebellion, but with questions, with light, with books bound in leather and drawn by candlelight, with the soft scratch of quills against parchment, words rising from the dead. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth. It was a return from exile. And at the centre of that return stood Rome, no longer erased but resurrected, not as it had been, but as a memory powerful enough to reshape the world. The erasure had failed, but what had truly been lost, what might never be fully recovered, was the time. 1,000 years where voices were silenced, roads crumbled, knowledge scattered like ash. And yet, even after all that, the echo remained, soft, persistent, human. Beneath the brushstrokes of Botticelli and the chisel marks of Michelangelo, something deeper stirred, not just beauty, but memory of a world that had once been silenced. Columns stood again, domes were drawn on paper, statues emerged from marble, their gazes turned not to heaven, but inward, toward reason, toward man, toward something Rome had always known. The rediscovery wasn't just architectural or artistic, it was spiritual, not the spirituality of saints and relics, but of questions. What makes a life meaningful? What is justice? What lies beyond the reach of kings? And for the first time in centuries, Europe looked backward and forward at once. Rome was no longer a cautionary tale, it was a template. Not a perfect one, but a daring one. A reminder that humanity had once organised itself without total darkness, that there had been order without chains, that laws could be forged without divine threat, that roads, bridges, baths, libraries, all could exist for the common good. It was a slow awakening, but with every ancient manuscript translated, every fresco restored, every ruin mapped, pieces returned, not just to the scholars and painters, but to the people. They began to speak of civitas again, of the res publica, of rights, of duties, of reason. Words once whispered only in monasteries now echoed in marketplaces and universities. And still the old powers flinched, because with every ounce of memory Rome recovered, the silence of the centuries cracked. How do you govern a people who remember they once governed themselves? How do you keep control of a world that recalls it once had roads without tolls, bridges without bribes, ideas without permission? The answer was, you don't. You can only stall the tide. And as printing presses spread across Europe like wildfire, the tide rose. Ideas poured forth, not just religious ones, but civic ones, political ones, philosophical ones, and many of them bore Roman fingerprints. Cato, Cicero, Livy, Seneca. Their words weren't just preserved, they were revived. They began to speak again, to argue, to inspire, to incite. Rome's voice, muted for so long, now shouted through ink and flame. Some heard that voice and feared it. Others called it salvation, but no one could ignore it. Even empires that had once tried to erase it began to borrow from it. Monarchs dressed their courts in Roman imagery. Architects mimicked its forms. Even the church, which had once distanced itself from the pagan city, now claimed its legacy. St. Peter's rose like a Roman temple reborn, its dome casting shadows over centuries of suppression. Rome was no longer buried, it was back, and everyone wanted a piece. But beneath all the marble and mimicry, a question lingered. Could a world built on forgetfulness ever truly honour what it had remembered? Rome's return was not without distortion. Its complexities were flattened, its contradictions ignored. The empire that had once enslaved millions was now a symbol of freedom. The republic that had crumbled into dictatorship was praised as pure. Memory, after all, is never perfect, especially when it's been reconstructed from ruins. Yet still, the echo was there. It reminded us that history is not a straight line, but a spiral, that what falls can rise again, but never quite the same, and that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance isn't revolution or rebellion, but remembering. Rome had been erased, but memory, true memory, is harder to kill than any city. The world that emerged from the shadows of Rome's ghost was no longer the one that had once trembled beneath its legions, but it carried something with it, a faint outline, a silhouette of the old empire pressed into the parchment of a new age. You could see it in the city plans of Paris and London, echoing old Roman grids, in the legal codes of emerging kingdoms, modelled on Roman law, in the arches, columns, and domes rising once more, not as relics, but as foundations for new power. The West wasn't just remembering Rome, it was building on its bones. But something strange happened along the way. As people reached for Rome, they began to rewrite it. The empire became a myth, a symbol of lost greatness, a mirror for modern ambition. No longer was it a place of contradictions, of cruelty wrapped in civility, of innovation drenched in conquest. It became an idea. The glory of Rome, they called it, the grandeur, the order, the might. But they forgot the blood, the doubt, the slow decay, the warnings. Rome's collapse had once been an instruction manual in what not to do, but as centuries passed it was turned into a pedestal, and standing atop it were kings, tyrants and revolutionaries alike, each claiming they were bringing Rome back, each swearing they'd learned its lessons, few had. By the time Europe thundered into the modern age, the erasure was nearly complete, not of Rome itself, but of why it had fallen, why it had been buried, why it had been forgotten. Its name was everywhere, on coins, on buildings, in titles of empires desperate to feel eternal. But the deeper truths, the uncomfortable ones, still avoided. Because if you look closely, Rome didn't fall simply because of barbarians at the gate. It fell because of rot within, corruption, greed, stagnation, a widening gap between rich and poor, political theatre replacing civic responsibility, militarization of domestic power, suppression of dissent, worship of spectacle over substance. Sound familiar? That's the part history quietly leaves out. That's the part erased again and again. Because it doesn't just indict the ancient world, it reflects on ours. Maybe that's why Rome has always haunted the present. Not just because it was magnificent, but because it was mortal. Its ruins don't just speak of what once was. They whisper warnings, reminders that no civilization, no matter how grand, is immune to forgetting itself. No power is eternal, not when its people grow numb, not when memory is filtered, not when truth becomes a tool. Rome became a myth to make us forget that it had ever been real. But those stones still stand, those roads still stretch, that echo still lingers. And if you stop, if you really listen, you'll hear it, in the cracks of our own society, in the things we glorify, in the things we dismiss. The same seeds planted in marble now take root in steel and concrete. We live in echoes, we build in ruins, we dream with borrowed memories, and if we're not careful, we'll forget how it all began. Not with swords, but with silence, not with war, but with forgetting. Rome didn't just fall, it was erased, and it can happen again. Somewhere along a quiet stretch of the old Via Appia, the stones still whisper, not in Latin, not in crumbling script, but in the language of time itself, weathered, hushed, and relentless. Travellers once passed here, under the shadow of empires. Now only wind moves freely. And yet, there's a strange power in ruins. They don't lie. You can cover them up, repurpose them, even forget they exist, but they remain. They outlast the names etched in books. They outlive the kings and popes who tried to inherit the old world's majesty, because the truth embedded in stone is harder to erase than the one on parchment. But even stones fade if no one listens. So how does an empire, vast and defiant, get reduced to fragments, both in history and in memory? It begins with a shift. A gentle one, not a fall, but a transformation. A political language begins to change. Institutions become fragile. Loyalty to ideals gives way to loyalty to individuals. Bureaucracy thickens and purpose thins. A society once powered by civic duty slowly learns the art of passive survival. When fear replaces participation, the centre weakens, and when the centre weakens, it fractures. Rome had once been a republic where the voice of the citizen mattered, at least in theory. But by its final centuries, that voice had been muzzled beneath layers of hierarchy, privilege, and spectacle. People were fed stories of grandeur, while their reality grew increasingly unlivable. And then, it wasn't just the empire that collapsed, it was belief in the empire. That's what often gets overlooked. Before the legions stopped marching, before the borders cracked open, the idea of Rome had already begun to fade in the minds of its own people. That's the most dangerous kind of collapse, when people stop believing the system matters, when the rituals of power continue, but the spirit behind them is gone. We remember the invaders, the sackings, the flames, but Rome was already hollow when the sword struck, and still we recreate its rituals. Presidents pose like emperors, capitals design themselves in marble, democracies flirt with authoritarian nostalgia. Everyone wants the image of Rome, none want the burden of its lessons. What's eerie isn't just how Rome disappeared, it's how familiar its disappearance feels. Power concentrated in the few, an economy tilting toward inequality, an obsession with entertainment over substance. Citizens disengaging, not because they don't care, but because they feel they no longer matter. Rome didn't burn in a day, it dimmed, it drifted. And finally, it was forgotten, not with violence, but with convenience. New rulers rewrote old histories. They had to, because remembering Rome truthfully was dangerous. It meant facing the consequences of apathy, of arrogance, of forgetting what power is supposed to serve. So instead, they wrote legends. They praised the emperors who broke the republic. They glorified the wars that weakened the frontiers. They called decline a golden age, because that's how you erase the fall, by pretending it never really happened. But ruins don't lie. They stand even when stories fail. They wait. And one day, someone notices. They pick up a piece of pottery, a coin, a carved slab with a half-legible name, and they start asking questions. Not about how Rome died, but about how we forgot it was alive. The echoes of Rome live in strange places, not just in its broken temples or toppled statues, but in things we do without thinking: a handshake, a senate, a calendar. Even the roads beneath our cities often follow the ghost tracks of Roman engineers. It's as if we've built over their bones and called it progress. But if you listen closely, you can hear how much of their world still haunts ours, not in language or stone, but in silence. Because much of what Rome was, we're not supposed to talk about. We hear about the grandeur, the amphitheatres, the aqueducts, the marble facades, but no one tells you about the stolen gods, the razed villages, the scrolls burned because they questioned the wrong truths. Rome didn't just conquer land, it conquered memory. It chose which parts of itself would survive. And it was very selective. Ask yourself why we know so little about the voices of its enemies. Why entire tribes, kingdoms, and movements simply vanish from the timeline once Rome arrives. It's not because they didn't matter, it's because Rome made sure they didn't matter later. And after Rome fell, those who came after did the same thing: the church, the kings, the scholars. They all cherry-picked what Rome meant. Some adopted its laws, others its symbols, a few even claimed its blood. But each one rewrote the script a little more. Until eventually, Rome wasn't a place or a memory, it was a mirror. Something each generation looked into and saw whatever they wanted. For the medieval rulers, Rome was the divine right to rule. For the Renaissance thinkers, it was a lost perfection to be revived. For empires of the modern age, it became a blueprint: how to conquer, how to rule, how to leave monuments behind as proof of your greatness. But none of them really told the truth, because Rome, in truth, was never just one thing. It was a republic and an empire, a sanctuary and a slaughterhouse, a cradle of ideas and a factory of oppression. It was both light and shadow. And when you erase the parts that don't fit the story you want to tell, you're not remembering Rome, you're inventing it. The tragedy is that we've built our own history on top of these inventions. We use Rome to justify the present, to claim we've inherited civilization, to pretend we're the continuation of something wise, grand, and destined, but we forget the warnings buried in the ruins. That arrogance ruins empires faster than any barbarian, that overreach burns brighter than invasion, that no civilization is too grand to fall, only too proud to admit it's falling. And so we stand in modern marble halls with Roman columns, speak in courtrooms designed by Roman ideals, drive on roads that echo Roman engineering, and never stop to ask if we're walking toward the same edge. The erasure wasn't just about forgetting Rome, it was about forgetting what Rome tried to teach us, and what it begged us not to repeat. We didn't listen. We polished the past until it glittered. And now, as the foundations shift beneath us, we wonder why the sky feels heavier, the air colder, the voices angrier. Maybe it's because deep down we know we're standing in the ruins again, we just haven't admitted it yet. In the quiet corners of old European cities, where alleyways twist like veins and stones whisper underfoot, something ancient still lingers. Not just the physical bones of Rome, the aqueduct arches, the reused columns, the mosaic fragments hidden beneath churches, but something deeper, a pattern, a ghost. People forget that Rome didn't die all at once, it unravelled. Bit by bit, law gave way to decree. Coins lost their weight in silver, roads cracked, armies deserted, loyalty turned into bribes. And yet, life went on. People bought bread, argued in markets, sang to their children. That's the uncomfortable truth. Collapse doesn't always look like fire and screaming. Sometimes it's just silence where there used to be music. It's bureaucracy turning into confusion. It's a border no longer guarded. It's a harvest missed because the road to the farm fell apart. And still, no one believes they're living through the end. Not the senators trading favours, not the priests blessing broken altars, not the shopkeepers counting devalued coins. They all think this is temporary. Rome will fix itself, it always has, until it doesn't. And by the time people realize the empire is gone, it's already buried under generations who grew up without remembering it was ever real. But here's the part they never tell you. Rome didn't just vanish. It was unmade by the people who inherited it. Because in the power vacuum that followed, every ruler, warlord, and priest had a choice: honor what was left, or reshape it in their image. Most chose the latter. Some erased Rome out of hatred. Others rewrote it for political gain. A few even romanticized it beyond recognition. And what survived was not a memory, but a mosaic of half-truths, broken pieces glued together by ambition. In that chaos, forgeries flourished, fake documents proving the divine authority of kings, fabricated lineages linking lords to Roman heroes, myths born not from history but from need. Because if you could claim the Roman past, you could claim Roman power. Even today, that game hasn't stopped. Governments still cite Rome when drafting laws. Military academies study Roman campaigns. Political theorists dig through Latin texts to justify modern control, as if invoking Rome makes their rule more valid. But what if what they're invoking isn't even real? What if the Rome they worship is the one that was invented after the fall? Not the Rome of the people, of the plebeians, of the slave who dreamed of freedom, or the woman who prayed for safety, but the Rome of symbols, the Rome of statues and slogans, the Rome of power. That's what survived, and that's what was passed on century after century. Not the full truth, but the version that made empires feel justified. So when you walk through a capital city today and see those Roman pillars, those Latin inscriptions, those marble lions, you're not seeing history. You're seeing a costume, one that's been worn for so long we forgot it was ever a disguise. And beneath that disguise, the real Rome is still waiting to be remembered. There's a strange silence in the record between the Rome that once stood and the world that replaced it, as if someone had taken a red pen to history and crossed out everything inconvenient. And in that silence, something even stranger happened. Memory became myth, myth became truth, and truth faded like smoke in the wind. You see, for centuries after Rome's collapse, the ruins were still too fresh, too real. People didn't speak of it in the past tense, they lived beside its bones. They stole bricks from its temples, melted statues for coins, repurposed forums into graveyards. They didn't preserve the empire, they cannibalized it to survive. But the real erasure didn't come from ignorance, it came from design. Because those who rose in Rome's absence had no interest in sharing the stage with a ghost that loomed too large. Kings couldn't tolerate comparisons to emperors. Priests needed their own divine mandates, not ones whispered in Latin. The church, powerful and rising, had to weave its own tapestry with threads plucked from Rome but dyed anew. So they began to edit. Stories once sung of pagan victories were rewritten into cautionary tales. Names of emperors were cleansed or condemned. Monuments were renamed. And in dusty monasteries, monks carefully copied manuscripts, sometimes skipping paragraphs, sometimes correcting them. This wasn't accidental. This was the quiet murder of memory. The glory of Rome, its flaws, its genius, its contradictions, was too dangerous, too powerful. So it was reshaped to fit the narrative of the day, rebranded as the prelude to something holier, nobler, more righteous. And where Rome didn't fit, it was omitted. Libraries vanished in suspicious fires, artifacts were buried under new churches, statues had their faces chiselled off, and the people, over time, forgot what those faces even looked like. The erasure was not just physical, it was spiritual. Imagine being born in the shadow of the Colosseum and never being told what it was. walking past broken aqueducts, thinking they were built by giants or devils, living in the very city that ruled the known world, yet believing you were poor, cursed, forgotten. Generations grew up blind to their inheritance, not because the knowledge was lost, but because it was hidden. And yet, fragments endured. In lullabies passed down in families, in half-remembered Latin phrases whispered in prayer, in roads that refused to crumble even when their purpose was long gone, Rome may have been erased, but not completely. Its soul was too stubborn. It lingered in the angles of architecture, in the laws scribbled into parchment, in the idea, dangerous, revolutionary, that power could be secular, rational, organized. So even as kings ruled by divine right, they borrowed Roman titles. Even as new empires rose, they mapped themselves against old Roman borders. Even as history was rewritten, the original ink still bled through. You just had to look closely enough. Because the truth is, Rome never truly died. It was buried, like a treasure someone was afraid others might find. And for those with the patience to dig, it still speaks. Beneath the layers of dust, beneath the broken stones and forgotten names, something still breathes, not just ruins, not just relics, but a voice, a presence. Rome was not erased entirely, it was scattered like ashes across 1,000 landscapes, and those ashes took root. What makes the story so haunting is not that Rome fell, everything falls eventually. Empires, kings, cities, none are spared. What unsettles the soul is how Rome's fall was so carefully concealed, as though someone needed the world to forget, as though history itself was rewritten with trembling hands, erasing not only what was lost, but why it was lost. And that silence left space for stories, stories that filled the vacuum with myths of decadence, corruption, divine wrath, stories that blamed the victims, or exalted the invaders, depending on who was holding the pen. But truth doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. It lingers, like smoke after a fire, curling around the edges of what we're told. Somewhere in those shadows, the real Rome waits. Not the marble statues and triumphal arches, but the people, the merchants who whispered in alleyways, the legionnaires who died in forgotten valleys, the mothers who lit lamps at twilight and prayed for sons who would never return. Their stories were not carved in stone, they were carried in breath, in blood, in silence. And silence is fragile, cracks always form. A letter survives in a buried scroll. A fresco is uncovered beneath a monastery. A forgotten manuscript turns up in an attic. And each time it happens, the illusion flickers. Rome, the erased, returns in fragments, challenging what we thought we knew. It's not just about what we lost, it's about what was taken from us. Because to erase Rome was to erase a mirror, one that reflected both brilliance and brutality. It showed humanity at its most ambitious and its most cruel. It asked questions that still echo. Can order survive without freedom? Can power exist without corruption? Can civilizations endure without memory? The answers aren't easy, they never were. But the search for them is what makes history alive. Not the sanitized timelines or curated museums, but the ache of something just out of reach. The suspicion that what we've been taught is only half the story. And maybe that's where Rome still lives. Not in textbooks, not in ruins, but in the hunger to understand, in the fire that burns in those who refuse to accept silence, in every whispered doubt, every unearthed relic, every voice, like yours, that dares to ask, what really happened? Because empires don't vanish without a trace. Someone buries them, and someone, someday, digs them back up. You're holding the shovel now.